It was 1977. I had taken time off work to have a baby and stay home with her, but I still needed an income. So my mother had hired my younger sister and me to do the dirty, back-breaking work in her shop while she took care of her first infant granddaughter. My sister and I were working at our mom's antique store one summer day. Mom had just gotten a truckload of European oak furniture that needed to be cleaned and polished, have the handles screwed on, and so forth. A nice-looking young man came into the store and started talking to my sister, who was 17 at the time. He introduced himself as Ted Smith, and we laughed and said we must be related as Mom's maiden name was Smith also. He chatted both of us up, but focused on Sis for the most part. He purchased an armoire, but said he'd have to go get his truck, since at the moment he was driving his VW Bug, an old VW Bug. He then asked my sister and me if we wanted to go out to dinner that night with him. We were sweaty and dirty from work. I had a baby to care for, and Sis already had a boyfriend, so we said, "Thanks, but no thanks, Ted." He asked me to ride with him to get his truck so he could drop his Bug off at the auto shop for repairs, but by that point I had to get home to my infant right away because I was still nursing her and I thought my breasts were going to begin leaking at any minute. However, he wouldn't give up trying to get one or both of us away from the shop. He said he could come back about 10 o'clock that evening for his armoire and asked whether one or both of us be there. We replied, "No, we close the shop at 6 and we both have places to be tonight." He was persistent. "How about tomorrow night?" "No, we close at 6 o'clock, except on Saturdays, when we close at 4 o'clock. He asked whether one of us could meet him early in the morning, like at 5:30 a.m., but neither of us wanted to. He was getting to be a bit creepy and Sis and I were eye-rolling at each other. Eventually, he said he was sorry, but he couldn't buy the armoire if we couldn't be flexible. We hated to give up the sale, but after he had been there for 2 hours, we thought he was just looking and taking up our time. We still had a lot of work to do on the furniture that had just arrived in the shop. Finally, we just wanted to finish our work and go home. At 6 p.m., as we were leaving, his VW Bug was parked outside and he asked us whether we want to go for coffee. He especially wanted my sister to go. We said, "Thanks, Ted, but no thanks, like we said earlier. We have plans." But he continued to be insistent. Finally I said, "Sis, let's go. I'll take you home." Even though she had her car there, for some reason I didn't want to leave her to drive home alone with this guy around. So he drove off in his Bug, and we really didn't think of it again. Until the next year, when a picture appeared in the paper. It was Ted Bundy. It still sends chills up my spine. My sister and I talk about it occasionally. We were two lucky young women that day. If either of us had agreed to go, we would have been raped and murdered like the at least 30 other women Bundy kidnapped. I was living in student apartments next to the community college where I was taking classes. The best thing about living there was the forest behind the college. It was big and it had lots of trails. There were always people on the trails during the daytime, neighborhood people walking their dogs, students taking breaks between classes, stoners sneaking puffs where they wouldn't be seen. By night, though, the woods were empty, except for us. My friends and I went back there on a very regular basis, and someone had discovered a long-abandoned fire pit next to a pond. It was down in a natural depression in the ground, making the light from the fire invisible to anyone who might be staying late at the college, or so we like to think. In the years we spent going out there, sometimes almost every night, we almost never ran into anyone else. So, I knew these trails like the back of my hand. I could go on the deepest, darkest night and still find my way by the light of the stars. I didn't ever bring a flashlight, and this was the early 2000s, before smartphones and their LED lights even existed. My night vision was all I needed. My friends didn't always want to come out, so there were plenty of nights when I went by myself, made my own little fire, and just wrote in my notebook for a while, scribbling whatever profound thoughts occurred to my 20-year-old self. I was all alone, or so I thought. There were occasionally times when something felt strange out there. It was a forest, so there were unfamiliar noises, weird shadows dancing at the edges of the fire's light, faint glimmerings in the dark. These could have been anything: the wind, a raccoon, maybe just my mind playing tricks. Only a person who knew the trails as well as I did could reach that fire circle without either using a flashlight or making a lot of noise, though, either of which would have alerted me in an instant. And so it was that one night I was out there by myself in the fall, just as the weather was starting to turn cold for the year. I had a nice little fire going, and I was scribbling away in my notebook. I was perfectly at home. The crickets were chirping, but nothing else was happening. Then, suddenly, I heard a noise. Ding! I froze. Then I bolted into the woods as quickly as I could, but making an effort to quiet my footfalls. My notebook tumbled to the ground as I ran. I melted into the shadows close to the nearest path, and I watched and listened, trying to get my heartbeat under control. What I'd heard had been the sound of an early 2000s era cell phone receiving a text message. It had been clear as a bell, and loud, and very close. It had come from just by the path at the edge of the pond. It would be a perfect spot for someone to watch me without being seen. I strained to detect any movement at all. It was so dark, all I could really rely on was my ears. There was no crunching of twigs, no brushing of leaves, no sound of any movement. Even my friends who came out there all the time with me couldn't sneak up on me there. It was very difficult to move on those narrow trails without making a racket, although I seemed to have a knack for it. I waited and waited. There was just nothing. No further ding noises. No footfalls. Only a few crickets. A chilly breeze rustled some leaves. Someone had to still be there, right? Whoever had been there, silently watching me, had to still be there, or I would have heard them leave, right? My imagination ran wild. I imagined some silent hunter who'd trained in the jungles of Vietnam or in some kind of backwoods militia, more quiet than I could ever hope to be, waiting to do who knows what to my tender body. As the minutes ticked by, I started to doubt the noise I'd heard. I might have been distracted by the sounds from the fire and by my writing earlier, so that someone might have snuck up close without my noticing. Now, though, completely focused on detecting the slightest noise? No way. I'd sooner believe I hallucinated that cell phone ding in the first place than that someone could sneak away through those paths without making a sound. It refused to believe it. I waited and waited, and finally I decided that it was time to get out of there. If someone was still there, they had more patience than I did. I started walking in the opposite direction from which I'd had the noise, going the long way around the pond and then toward the soccer fields instead of toward the college building. I focused on speed more than stealth, and I knew anyone out there would be able to hear me. I reasoned that if they came after me, I'd hear it before they got close, and I'd just run for all I was worth. I knew the trails, after all. I made it back to the college and checked the parking lot to see if the stalker was parked there, but the lot was completely empty. I made my way back home, looking over my shoulder every minute to see if some shadowy figure were trailing me. So what was it? I'm convinced the sound was real, because it was just so loud and clear, coming right across the water. I wouldn't have been so startled by an imaginary noise. I did find something out there once, the following summer. It was a makeshift shelter, built in a tangle of downed trees, covered with a plastic tarp and then concealed with sticks. No personal possessions remained inside, but it looked like it had previously been occupied for quite some time, maybe for months. All that time I'd been out there, with friends and sometimes alone, had someone been living there, sneaking up to keep an eye on us from the darkness? The thought still sends a shiver down my spine. Someone was out there. In December 2003, Joyce Vincent died of an asthma attack in her North London flat. The television was still on. The mail continued to be delivered. Her rent was automatically deducted from her bank account. The days passed, and nobody realized that she had died. The days became weeks, and the weeks into months. There were large containers in the building next to hers, so the neighbors should have paid more attention to the smell coming from her apartment. The flat was full of noisy kids and teens, and no one questioned the constant buzz of the TV in the background. Finally, Joyce's bank account dried up. Her landlord sent her collection letters. Like the others, those letters fell on the piles of junk scattered on the floor. They received no response. Finally, with over 6 months of rent overdue, the landlord obtained a court order to evict her by force from the premises. Court officers broke down the door, and they only discovered her body. It was January 2006, more than 2 years after her death. At that time, no one came looking for Joyce Vincent. Neither family, friends, coworkers, nor neighbors knocked on the door to see if everything was going well. No one called. No one signed up. She was 38 years old when she died.